Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the color of compromise as we watch Dr. Tisby lead us through some conversations about the history of the church, especially as it has to deal with the different facets of racism. And over the course of this past week, a couple of opportunities came my way and came your way too. First of all, public broadcasting television carried a special, has two parts to it actually, on the Black church. I only caught the last half hour of part two, so I'm eager to go back and pick it up and look at it. And I would commend it to your attention too. I think one of the great strengths of Black culture is, in fact, the Black church. In fact, they say that without any sense of regret in their voice. So you'll want to perhaps catch up with that. And then two, someone sent my way an interview. Again, it's in two parts. It was done by some of the folks at Focus on the Family, and it features Dr. Shelby Steele, who's written some important articles and books, and I commend that to your attention. Dr. Steele is a member of the Hoover Institute, which is a scholarly think tank, so to speak, out of Stanford University. So he carries with him some very important credentials. I watched part one, and I'm anxious to go ahead and watch part two as soon as I can. So I commend those two programs to your attention to add to what we're doing here with regard to the color of compromise. I want to welcome everybody, and we'll get right to the article that's before us as we look now to what amounts to the pre-Declaration of Independence days. And you're going to recognize a name that is known around these parts. We have a very important and significant ministry that goes on in downtown New York at the Crispus Attucks building. And you'll catch up with Crispus Attucks and why he is so important and why his name has made it into other communities as well, even though the most important thing that we know for Crispus Attucks happened in the Boston area as part of the early Revolutionary War. So let's get to that, and I'll share this screen. Make sure the sound is on. And here we go.
Crispus Attucks. You remember him, don't you? Sure you do. He was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre in 1770 and was part of the events of what became the Revolutionary War. What you may not know about Crispus Attucks is that he was born in the 1720s in what's called a praying town of Christianized Indians. He was born a slave and escaped. He was also of Native American and African descent. So his blood represented the racial mix of America and a symbol of so many people of color who fought, bled, and died for a nation that failed to recognize their freedom. In the age of revolution and revival, liberty became the rallying cry. But that liberty was limited. It didn't apply, at least not in its fullest sense, to all kinds of groups of people, including women, Native Americans, and of course, people of African descent. So we're going to explore the lofty ideals of liberty and then the everyday contradictions of the notion of justice and liberty that this nation was supposedly founded on, and how the American church participated in and defended this contradiction between freedom and slavery embedded in the very foundations of this young nation. You can go all the way back to the Declaration and the War for Independence. Now, let's do a little political philosophy here. John Locke, he wrote a document called Two Treatises of Government. Now, you may not have read this document, but you'll be familiar with some of the ideas. He wrote that natural law teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. John Locke also wrote that government exists by the consent of the people. Now, Thomas Jefferson, one of the principal authors of the Declaration of Independence of 1776, he picks up on these ideas from John Locke. And he writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, Jefferson penned these words, and he was a slaveholder. He, along with others, assumed that the ideals of the Declaration applied only to white men. Now, Black people knew of something called the Declaration of Independence. They knew about ideas of freedom and liberty, of justice. They heard this language and this language of revolution, and they applied it to their own situation as enslaved persons. There was a letter that a group of Africans wrote in 1773 to the Massachusetts General Assembly. They said, "We cannot but expect your house will again take our deplorable case," meaning their enslavement, "into serious consideration, and give to us that ample relief which as men we have a natural right to." Freedom, equal treatment under the law, liberty in all senses, that white men enjoyed it. That's what these men were asking. That's what all enslaved people were asking. And Black people fought for the Patriots, and they fought for the British, both on the promise of their freedom. Yet white supremacy, racism, and slavery endured long after the American Revolution had ended. Revolution had its limits. In the mid-1700s, a wave of religious revivals swept parts of the colonies. So we're not just talking about political revolution, we're talking about spiritual revival. And these revivals held both promise and contradiction when it came to the African inhabitants of America. Early on in the colonial era and this era of revolution, there were few African converts to Christianity in America. Enslavers didn't want to proselytize to the enslaved because, again, you would get these ideas of freedom and liberty and equality. Plus, Africans had their own spirituality. They weren't coming as blank slates, and they tried to retain their own religion as best as possible. But then there were these revivalists, and this was something new and different in the experience of religion in America, mainly Baptists and Methodists. And what stood out about these revivalists is that they helped their audience feel the weight of sin and to imagine the threats of hell in order to accept Christ as their only Savior.
This was called the
These revivalist preachers focused on the simple act of conversion rather than getting into complicated doctrinal issues. They would attend these huge mass meetings, often still on a segregated basis, but Black and white people were there. They heard the same sermons, they prayed the same prayers, and they converted together. But people of African descent made Christianity their own. They didn't just adopt the religion of their slave owners. They made it something that was distinctly African and served them. There was something called the ring shout, and it was adapted from West African spiritual tradition. People would get in a circle, they would stomp, and they would sing, and it was a communal event of worship. Now, the number of African converts remained small early in the days of the United States, but the first major influx of African-descended people into American Christianity came during these revivals. One example of these converts is Lemuel Haynes. In 1785, He became the first black person ordained by any Christian fellowship in America. In terms of his theological influences, he drew on Jonathan Edwards and George Whitfield to form and shape his theology. He was biracial, mixed black and white, and he preached to a white congregation in Vermont for much of his ministry. But equality had its limits. Affirmations of spiritual equality did not translate into social equality. So African clergy and Christians had many restrictions. A lot of them could never be ordained. If they were ordained or licensed, they could only preach to all black congregations. They heard sermons from white people that focused on slaves being obedient to their masters. And they couldn't oftentimes gather on their own for worship. They had to be supervised. Now, slave rebellions or the fear of them often further restricted the liberty of enslaved Africans, especially when it came to congregating for worship. In this revivalist period, there are a few rock stars. One of them is George Whitfield. Now, he is actually not from the United States. He was British, but he symbolized the spiritual revival that took place in the 18th century. He was an Anglican minister from England who was influenced by John Wesley, his mentor, and one historian called him the first intercolonial religious celebrity. He preached outdoors because no indoor venue could even hold the crowds that would flock to hear him speak. Unfortunately, George Whitfield had some pretty disappointing views on slavery. He was ambivalent about it. One of his letters said that he was unsure whether it be lawful for Christians to buy slaves, and that when they did buy slaves, that it was positively sinful to use them as though they were brutes. So in other words, he's debating, well, I don't know if it's okay for Christians to buy slaves, but he separated that from actually owning slaves. And he said, well, if you do own human beings as slaves, then you can't treat them as brutes. So he wanted to moderate the practice of holding people in bondage, but not abolish it altogether. Now that ambivalence kind of completely gives way later on. In 1732, Georgia was founded as a non-slaveholding colony, the last of the 13 colonies. And the leaders in Georgia, they simply didn't want poor whites to be in competition with enslaved people of African descent for work. 1738, George Whitfield visits Georgia, and he found an ideal setting to start an orphanage in a small but growing town called Savannah. He calls his orphanage Bethesda, which if you break it down, it means house of mercy, and it still operates to this day. But as with many nonprofits, he struggled with financing it. He couldn't keep it afloat financially. And so to solve the problem, he turned to slavery. He purchased 640 acres of plantation land with the help of friends, and he used the profits from crops to fund the orphanage. Now, who harvested those crops? Who tilled the soil? Who did the weeding? It was enslaved people. In a letter to one of his supporters, Whitfield says, "One Negro has been given me, some more I plan to purchase this week." So that ambivalence about buying human beings seems to be gone. He even went further. He petitioned Georgia's political leaders to advocate for enslavement. He said, Georgia can never be a flourishing province unless Negroes are employed as slaves. Another contemporary of George Whitfield, who's just as well known, is a man named Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was a Calvinist pastor from Northampton, Massachusetts, and he's often called America's greatest theologian. He's known for sermons like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and for concepts like the religious affections, which he said feelings are necessary and experiences are necessary in the religious life. It's not just all an intellectual, cerebral experience. Jonathan Edwards was also a slaveholder. Now, when I was in seminary, Edwards was highly acclaimed, and his theology made it into multiple classrooms, and we had to read multiple works that he wrote. But few people talked about his views on slavery. This is one reason why knowing our church's history in relation to race is so vital. For racial and ethnic minorities, few things are as disorienting as finding out that someone held up as an example of a great theologian or preacher or pastor that we should learn from. And then you discover that he thought people who look like me were inferior. In 1733, Edward's church in Northampton experienced a revival. He described it and said there was scarcely a single person in the town, either old or young, that was left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. Yet this highly touted great man of God compromised with racism and actually practiced holding enslaved Africans. Why did he do this? Well, a few responses to that. One, Jonathan Edwards pastored kind of an elite church. And in those days, slaveholding was a symbol of status, kind of a keeping up with the Joneses kind of a thing. Another issue is that many Christians at this time had this stark separation between the gospel and social justice. Now, other traditions, particularly the Black Christian tradition, has never seen a sharp divide between those concepts, but many of what became evangelicals, they did. Historian Mark Knoll said, as a revival movement, evangelicalism transformed people within their inherited social setting, but worked only partial and selective transformation. What Knoll is describing is the fact that religion could change a person's behavior and make them kinder toward other people, but it didn't address the broader social and systemic issues that were creating a race-based social hierarchy in the society around them. Interestingly, Jonathan Edwards' son, Jonathan Edwards Jr., he didn't follow his father's example. For instance, he preached a sermon called The Injustice and Impolicy of the Slave Trade. Unfortunately, Jonathan Edwards Jr.'s views didn't really impact his father. Edwards and Whitfield are held up as theological and evangelistic heroes by many Christians. They preached a message of salvation, and yet the concern for African souls didn't translate to a concern for African bodies in bondage. And they weren't alone. Many other white Christians in their day didn't see anything wrong with enslaving human beings, and they believed the Bible merely regulated the practice instead of providing a principled opposition to it. Another example from this era where we can clearly see Christian complicity with racism is with the Baptist General Committee of Virginia. Now, although we focus on Christian complicity with slavery and racism, there was also some opposition to it. So in 1782, the Baptist General Committee formed. Then in 1785, it issued a statement opposing slavery. In 1790, it issued an even stronger statement. Baptist minister John Leland said it was against the law of God and inconsistent with a republican form of government to practice holding slaves. But the backlash to these pronouncements was swift and fierce. Baptists have a congregational polity, and so the only binding rules happen at the congregational level. And when these pronouncements made it to the congregations, enslavers demanded their rights to, quote, their property. So in 1793, the committee makes another declaration. They said, after considering it a while, the subject should be dismissed from this committee, as believing it belongs to the legislative body. Thus, Baptists in Virginia declared slavery a civil issue outside the scope of the church. Slave ownership became an accepted practice, and they could argue that it was a civil or a political issue and not a religious one. Compromise and complicity win yet again. It was in the midst of this compromise and complicity that the first historically Black Christian denomination got its start. Harsh though it may sound, the facts of history nevertheless bear this out. There would be no Black church without racism in the white church. The divides between Black and white Christians weren't generally over doctrines. It wasn't about the Trinity or the divinity of Jesus or personal conversion. It was about unequal treatment of African-descended people in white fellowships. So Black people had to figure out how to practice Christianity on their own. One of the ways they did this was through hush arbors. So there were all these rules against Black people, enslaved Africans, congregating for worship on their own outside of the supervision of a white person or white people. So what would happen is they would meet in secret. After a long day of work, Christians who were enslaved would go out to a secluded spot, say in the woods, far away from the sight of the plantation owner, and they would do their own worship. They would exposit the word as best they could. They would sing songs. They would dance. They would pray. And these were called the hush arbors, really the beginnings of the Black church in America. One of the historical facts that was kind of surprising to me as I researched this topic was that prior to the Civil War, Blacks and whites often worshiped together under the same roof. Now, don't get me wrong, this was not out of any sense of racial egalitarianism. It was more of a pragmatic concern. You see, whites wanted to monitor the Black people. They didn't want them congregating on their own. And this is how the African Methodist Episcopal Church gets its start. Two men, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, help tell the story. So Richard Allen was born a slave in Philadelphia in 1760. He converted to Methodism in 1777, and he became a preacher at the white St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. One Sunday in 1792, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, they unknowingly sat in a section reserved for whites. And Allen later on wrote about it in his journal. He said this: "We had not been long upon our knees before I heard considerable scuffling and low talking. I raised my head, and one of the trustees, having the hold of Reverend Absalom Jones, pulling him off his knees and saying, 'You must get up. You must not kneel here.' Mr. Jones replied, 'Wait until prayer is over.' And then the trustee says, 'No, you must get up now, or I will call for aid and force you away.' Mr. Jones said, 'Wait until prayer is over and I will get up and trouble you no more.'" Richard Allen goes on to write, "After that, we all went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in the church." They went down the street and formed a church called Bethel Church, now called Bethel AME or simply Mother Bethel, and it operates to this day. So in this age of revolution and revival, we have to say that it was a limited revolution, that revival largely did not oppose slavery, and that Christians sought to reform it, to condone it, and even to evangelize those within it. In other words, they were complicit in the creation of a racial caste system. Whitfield, Edwards, the trustees at St. George Methodist, all acquiesced to the practice of slavery and the view of darker-skinned people as somehow inferior. Even the nation, as they waged a revolutionary war for liberty, and as the church in America grew as a result of the First Great Awakening, the racial hierarchy hardened. All this talk of equality, liberty, and conversion did little to stop the institutionalization of slavery or deconstruct faulty ideas of race in America.
I can't hear you, Roger.
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I want to, before we get into discussion of what I think is a pretty important theological principle, to share with you about the Philadelphia scene. And the way I'll do that is, again, by sharing a screen. First of all, we'll go to St. John's or St. George's Methodist Church. And you'll see a picture of where that is up here, very close to where all of this goes, you know, the Independence Mall and Franklin Square are all there. Very important historical pieces. And as we look at where that is, kind of keep your finger, it's on North 4th Street. And notice here is South 4th Street, with Market Street being the dividing place. So keep that in mind, because now I want to stop sharing that and share with you Mother Bethel. So when you see where that is, I could kick myself because my daughter lived down here on South Street, and the cross street at which she lived was 4th Street. So when she took up nursing at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, she lived right about there, right where the arrow is. And if I had only known how close Bethel AME Church was to where she was living, I would definitely have gone there. The story you heard about Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, note here's where St. George's Methodist was. And when the Black leadership was kicked out, so to speak, or removed, what they really wanted them to do is move to the balcony. But what happened then, of course, was, what did he say? We left, and they what was the term? He said it was kind of like we bothered them no more. However, it was said when Tisby shared it, was interesting in the wording of it. But notice how close they are. Now I want to go to see pictures of Bethel AME Church. I'm just going to scroll through these. I think what's going on here. There we go. Just scroll through these so you get a sense. This is right down there near South and 4th Street. This is, by the way, in a little research I did on it, this is the oldest property continuously owned by Blacks in our nation. And so there you see the interior of the church that would have been. I want to get to a picture of what it would have looked like in that day. But here, it's quite a beautiful facility. We'll have to go somewhat quickly in order to get to these. If you see something you want me to stop at, you give me a holler. Oh, there we go. So this would have been the earliest building. Remember, Bethlehem Church had 2 predecessor buildings across the street, one built in 1850 and then one built in 1885 before moving across in the early 1900s to our present location. But this would have been the earliest building that Bethel would have used. And so I think the history of that is very significant, and it's especially significant because Methodism then showed its racism in such a way that it gave birth to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and quite a facility that is there today. There's one more that I thought you might be interested in. By the way, it's multiracial now. I have a a close-up picture of that historical sign, the historical marker that I wanted to get to that I thought you'd appreciate. There's the Rogues Gallery. We have one of those. Oh, come on, let's get there. Yeah, you know, being the first, they call it Mother Bethel. Well, I guess maybe I passed it by already. There's a sign that is of that style, but it's okay. Well, I don't want to waste too much time on that. What I'll do is very quickly do a share screen of St. George's Church, and just show you a picture or two of that facility. Okay, this would have been an old picture, and that's as it is today. And notice the simplicity of the structure. And it would have been very typical Methodist structure. When I was in England, we went to the church that Wesley built both in London and in Bristol, and they look very similar to that. Okay, and that's right up against you know, Independence Mall, right very close to. If you went down there and did your tourist thing, well, that's what you would see. All right, St. George's Church. So a historic moment, again, indicating how superiority, inferiority worked in the early church. It's kind of a sad thing in many respects, but that gave birth nonetheless. Gave birth nonetheless to the African Methodist Episcopal. And by the way, there are other African Methodist. There's the Christian Methodist Episcopal, which was caused by another separation in the church. There's a nice article on Crispus Attucks, by the way, in Wikipedia that you can catch pretty easily if you want to know. He has no connection with York, so to speak, but I guess because York was the first capital, perhaps they wanted to draw that historical moment into the city of York, and so we have the Crispus Attucks movement that still exists today, and you all, I don't live but a couple blocks away from all that. So, okay. Let me ask you first, what kind of reactions you had to this this particular presentation? Did anything strike you that maybe you were trying to make sense of all of this? Anything kind of come together for you?
I think it goes back to the first week, the statement made about contingency, that racism is a result of our deliberate choices. There's so many opportunities to make a different choice. Mm-hmm. And it's still continuing. Yeah, that's so sad.
Yeah, it kind of has its own momentum, doesn't it? A contingency leads to another contingency, and so we continue to live with that. Well said. Good. Any other connections? Well, then let me get to what I think is a very important point, and actually it's a point I made in this past week's sermon, in that George Whitfield and John Wesley were close with one another. And it was, in fact, George Whitfield who convinced John Wesley that he ought to go into field preaching, that he ought to go into preaching outdoors, that he should not be afraid of that, people are reached in that way in a very effective manner. And so Whitfield was in fact a better preacher than John Wesley, but was still Wesley was still a person who helped to form some of what Whitfield was about. Whitfield did go to the colonies and spend some time there. He didn't spend a lot of time there, but he was a key figure in what we know as the Great Awakening, or the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening happens roughly at the turn of the century, but in the mid-century, this spiritual awakening was happening. And he just mentioned two of the figures, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitfield. There were others that were extremely important and helped to move the spiritual life of the colonies in a positive direction, so to speak. However, there was a disconnect going on that, again, in this past week's sermon, I tried to connect. And the disconnect is having to do with when one preaches only for the moment of salvation, when one preaches only for new birth, if you stop there, you miss what is an essential connection. In Wesley's terminology, and this is where you might remember if you were able to listen to the sermon of this past week, in Wesley's terminology, he called it vital piety. When you preach for salvation, you are looking for a changed heart. And that changed heart then is the pious heart. And what happens is the pious heart is directed inward. It is a heart that is simply concerned about one's own spiritual life, so that you can do the disciplines of prayer, fasting, taking Holy Communion, availing yourself of the study of the Word, and subjecting yourself to worship. Those are the 5 primary disciplines. And when one practices those disciplines, one enhances one's piety. However, what's the missing piece? If I spend all of my time looking inward, it will be for my good, won't it? I mean, we're going to grow. There's definitely an important piece of me that needs to do that. I need to practice piety. But if that piety doesn't give birth to vitality, of proper action, of social justice, the disconnect happens where I can grab hold of my spiritual life without ever paying attention to how I'm treating my neighbor, or what kind of injustices might be happening over there. And so the thing that Wesley did that Whitfield did not was connect the two. That piety was essential. You must be born again. You must be born again. And so that piety is enhanced by the disciplines of the church that you and I practice. But what Wesley said is you've got to connect that with your attention to social justice, or else you fall into the danger that I was speaking on when Jesus says to not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will be accepted into the kingdom. Why is that? Why is that? You claim Lord, Lord, but your actions don't match up with your piety. And you're busy looking at your belly button while at the same time your neighbor is in need. And so connecting those two together is absolutely crucial. And one of the things that Tisby is sharing is that the Great Awakening did awaken people, but it did not necessarily connect the dot to social equality. In this case, social equality was the goal, but even social action or justice issues, you don't connect them. In his words, spiritual salvation did not always include earthly liberation. Whereas in the Black community, those always were connected. Those were always connected. Hence, you have the churches that begin to become the focal point, the center of social justice out of the Black church. Those are the place where the connections were made, and they're still the places where connections were made. Ebenezer Baptist Church. You say those words and automatically you understand. Here was a place where the heart beat for social justice, for spiritual equality and liberation issues. And so we have to connect those dots, or our piety without vitality becomes empty. Not everyone who cries, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom. That's a severe word, my friends. That's a severe word. And so I would encourage us to think along those lines, not only tonight as a result of the presentation, but also as we look forward to what comes next. Individual conversion and piety clearly did not match up with earthly liberation for the white male presence that was leading the country at the time. I guess as we imagine the Great Awakening, I don't want to minimize the good that it did. There was good that came of it, but it didn't connect to more goodness that could have been done. And so, getting back to Cindy's observation, we missed a great opportunity for contingency, a great opportunity for a new decision to be made so that it would open up opportunity. I keep returning, by the way, and be interested in your views on this. Really, what was driving this vehicle was economics. It was money. People, even when we talked about Whitfield and the orphanage he built, in order to support the orphanage, he had to employ slaves because he needed the work done. And he didn't employ them, he bought them and set them to work in order to make money. So economics is driving a lot of this, and pay particular attention to that as we look now to the period of this history that's called antebellum, before the war, because all of that is going to become front and center. It's the reason for the splits of the church to Methodist Episcopal Church in the north and the Methodist Episcopal Church south. It's what drives the train, and so keep your eye on that one as we move ahead. Okay, any reactions to all that? I just got off there a little bit. Hope you caught it. I don't want to dominate conversation like that, but it's an important point. I'll make one last point, and then I'll be quiet, and then we'll either conclude or have additional conversation that you generate. John Wesley, as I shared at the first session, John Wesley was clearly anti-slavery, clearly in every way. He had no time for it, no belief that anyone should own slaves. By the way, last week, Tisby shared about John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, wrote the lyrics for Amazing Grace. Newton fell under the influence when he was in port at Bristol in England, fell under the influence of a Methodist preacher. And it was this relationship with that Methodist preacher that caused Newton to experience salvation. And then, of course, as he tried to put his piety together with what he was doing as a captain of a slave ship, it didn't hold for him. And so he quit the trade and then became, of course, as Tisby said last week, became a pastor. So, piety and social justice has to connect in us. It has to connect so that we become active. Okay, there, I'm done. Any other observations?
This isn't an observation from this, but Tuesday, there was a letter in the York Daily Record. There is so much on racism right now. And it was by Matthew Keene. It says, America can start to heal when it works to become righteous. That's how we can heal. Mm-hmm. He says, when to the hungry man we routinely give something to eat, when we as a matter of habit provide water to a thirsty woman, when we clothe the naked, tend to the sick, visit the prisoner, when we work to empathize with those of different skin colors. And then he goes on, but he says, when we at last remove ourselves from a throne we have no right to occupy and live strictly by the law of love and leave the moral integrations and task of reward and punishment to the more qualified, he's talking about God, then and only then will we truly unite.
Mm. Yeah, where was he? Go ahead.
It's like everything you're saying, putting together.
Yeah, where did he grasp his as you were reading? I was, immediately going somewhere in Scripture. Where was he quoting from without truly quoting? What parable of Jesus was he alluding to? Remember, Jesus gathers the people in front of them, and then as a shepherd does, he does what? Sheep?
Yeah.
Goats. And he says to the sheep, come, O blessed of my Father, enter into the joy because of what you have done. And when you fed me, when you gave me to drink, when you clothed me, when you visited me, when you cared about me when I was sick and in prison, when you gave me a house when I was a stranger. And they said, when did we do these things? And so this righteousness that he's talking about is straight out of that parable in the 25th.
Right.
Straight out of there. And he adds to it, but it's putting our piety into action that makes the difference. Now, I'm not going to say that if someone has a deathbed conversion where they're not going to have the opportunity to do these things, that's another matter altogether, where someone says to God Almighty, I've made a mess of my life, forgive me, and then dies. I think God's grace is surely big enough. But those who make the moment of saying, yes, I'm born again, but then don't do diddly squat to make a difference in the life of another through simple things, feeding, giving drink, putting clothes on someone, welcoming a stranger, visiting the sick and in prison. This is lifeblood stuff that we shouldn't even need to talk about. Anybody who has an ounce of piety in them ought to have 2 ounces of action, it seems to me. I was sharing this morning, wasn't I? Those of you who were part of this morning, about, as I retire, has Bethlehem done anything that over the course of the years that we've been together? Have we done anything that accomplishes connecting that piety that we all know is important to actions that if we're going to be a vital church that make that difference? Have we done anything like that? And of course, your mind begins to rehearse some of those things, and prayerfully, I hope we have, but that's it. That's it. And that guy makes a great point. Great point. I don't know how many people are going to get it, but
yeah. Well, we've only attended the church a short time, but we noticed right away that they're a very loving church that does so much for the community.
Well, got to try.
Yeah, they always say that if you are born again, you will see people through God's eyes. That's how you have to look at it, through God's eyes, and then you will see the need.
Yeah. And then also you will have no room for racism. You'll have no room to see the other as anything but a child of God. Well, thank you all for this time together. We'll have another go at it next week. We will have to skip as we make our way through Lent. We'll have to skip, obviously, Maundy, Thursday, but whatever we skip, we'll pick up again. And I'm grateful for your conversation. And let me just do a quick evaluation. Is this valuable? Has this been valuable to you as we share together? Or you've come back, so I guess there's value seen.
Yes.
Well, it's good to see you all. Let's have a moment of prayer. Lord, our hearts are stirred when we give attention to the things that matter in life. And one of the things that will always matter as we try our best to follow your Son is how do we connect the clear piety that is called for in our converted life? How do we connect with the action that Jesus is just as clear about must be a part of our life? And so as we ask that question, reveal answers that matter to each one of us, for we all come at it from a different perspective. Each one of us is in a different place. All of us have different neighbors. And yet we know too that everyone is our neighbor. The Samaritan taught us that lesson. And so grant, oh God, that as we work out our own salvation, that it will always include love of neighbor, every neighbor, none above nor none below, the equality that you have given us in Christ. Thank you for this time together, for our conversation, and for the leadership that Dr. Tisby gives. And may we find in his leadership ways to be more intelligent as we talk. We pray in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, don't forget the PBS special that just stopped airing last evening about the Black Church, and also the YouTube articles that you can find on the Focus on the Family, where Dr. Shelby Steele is being interviewed. And just look for those opportunities to feed yourself with those things that can help make a difference. Thank you again for attending, and for anyone who's checking this out through the recorded version, maybe you'll join us as we continue our conversations. Always good to have more, and we'll be glad to see you. God bless you all. Take care. Love you.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
Bye.